amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. It's fun to be back with you again, and my guest today is Allison Alexander. Allison is the renowned Brisbane-based food consultant and the inaugural Queensland Food Fellow. She is well known to ABC listeners, and in 2020 was awarded an OAM for her services to the state's tourism and hospitality sector. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you.
You grew up in the Lockyer Valley and went to boarding school when you were 7, you said. Tell us a bit more about that.
I loved boarding school. Now, I think it's fair to say that most children at 7 would, be a bit out of their comfort zone. My mother wasn't well, so that was the reason for it. But it really was the best adventure of 10 years. Right. And I left just before I turned 17. Now,
was your mother a good cook, or you just came upon it?
My mother was the most terrible cook. We all survived well, my father and my brother and I, but that wasn't her skill. Her gardens were her skill, and she had the most amazing garden. It really was lovely. As for cooking, it was a very initially when we were in the Lockyer Valley and on the property, we had sheep as well as lucerne and potatoes. So lots of dishes that were not lamb, because you didn't kill your lambs, you killed the mutton, but I came to food much, much later, well into adulthood. So I really did have that gap in my childhood of growing up with food. And I had aunts who were good cooks, but we'd only visit them for a weekend or something.
And you went governessing after you left school. Was that sort of into the outback or somewhere remote?
It was a fair distance. I looked at the jobs on offer, and it was the one that was the furthest away. So that's how I chose it. And it was on a property just outside Burketown in the Gulf of Carpentaria.
Yes.
And it was just a wonderful, wonderful place to go to. The Camp family were there, and their 2 daughters were the children that I looked after. And it was a lovely property, Floraville, still owned by the same family.
Cattle or sheep? Or
cattle.
Right.
Oh, it's all cattle up in the Gulf.
Yes.
And they're Brahman cattle. So we ate beef, breakfast, lunch and dinner, truly. You would have a bit of steak with your egg for breakfast.
Right.
But I think that it really was a lovely adventure for me. That first year was so different. But it taught me such a lot too. And I've been lucky enough to go back there as an Australia Day ambassador about 10 years ago. And the little boy who was 18 months old on his mother's hip is now the mayor.
Oh, really? Oh, how lovely.
And it was just, it was so lovely. And he took me back to the property, and the memories came flooding back, of course.
How long were you there for?
Just a year.
Right.
Yes, yeah. And I think, though, that what stayed with me so much out of that visit was the distance. The time didn't matter.
Yes.
I got to eat goat meat for the first time when I was there, and I still love goat meat.
It's actually delicious, isn't it? We used to breed goats years and years ago, and delicious, yes.
Yeah.
Well, for their wool, but of course there were the male goats that weren't profitable, so they had to go in the pot. Now, in 1975, you went to Europe and spent time in Provence. And you said that was the moment that you decided you loved cooking. Tell us more about that.
You're absolutely right. That, I would say, was my light bulb moment.
Yes.
In that my husband and I married in 1971. I don't know what I cooked for those first 4 years.
Curry, probably. I curried everything, I think.
It was, a bit of an adventure there. But, yes, living in France really was an eye-opener, because we were in a house shared with some other Australians down in Provence, and it's what I call ratatouille country. So they grew tomatoes and eggplant and capsicum, olives, almonds, lots of almonds in that area. And we were in a farmhouse. It wasn't in a village. We were quite some distance from a village. So there was a hamlet of 6 houses, and 5 of them were owned by the farmers in that area. And ours was owned by a woman in Paris who just rented it out to tourists.
Right.
So we really had to eat and live on what was produced locally.
And what was in season? And we're going to come to that a little bit later, but the French are wonderful, aren't they, at utilising whatever is in season at that particular time.
I think that it's really easy to look at communities in rural areas anywhere in the world because they essentially have to work with the season. Yes. And where we were in France was very definitely that. And our local market would only have what was grown pretty much locally. Now, if you go to Europe now, the markets there will not only have local product, but they will have it from further afield. And that's communications, that's the way we live in the world. But it's still in those smaller communities, I think season is important. And when I hark back to my childhood, that's the one thing that I did know about in possibly food, but I didn't connect it in my mind that way. But I always knew that potatoes grew in the winter.
Yes.
They were never, ever a summer crop. So you didn't look for certain things in those times where lettuce was something that, again, the leafy green crops, yes, the cabbages, they were a winter crop. Summer is very harsh in the Lockyer Valley, and it's its downtime even now compared to what it used to be.
Yes.
But they've developed now the crops of corn and beans,
right,
as their summer crops. But back to France, it was a great learning curve for me as to what foods were available. And then, of course, I had to learn how to cook. And I really didn't know.
Yes.
So I had some very good mentors there. I was very lucky.
Oh, how wonderful. But there's nothing, as I said, to, like the fresh food that comes from the markets. Cool storage, unfortunately, has stopped a lot of that happening even in our own supermarkets and a lot of our food stores. And particularly, I know in Tasmania, the apple industry was really hit when cool storage came in. And we lost a lot of the market in Europe for our apples. Yes, as I say, it's just wonderful, isn't it, if you can go to a local market and get what is in season at that particular time. But back in Australia now, you put so many of those French ideas into practice and you went to the School of Food. That must have been fascinating.
It was. I came back and knew that I wanted to work in food, but had no idea what I was going to do, where I was going to do it, and how I was going to learn. And so I cooked my heart out for the next few years. And predominantly I had learnt about Elizabeth David when I was in London and then on into France. So that was my basic book that I learnt from, which of course became famous many years later, but wasn't to me. And then Mastering the Art, Jane Grigson was a great influence on me as well. And so I was cooking from those books. And then I heard about a course that was being run in Sydney, and I'd said to my husband, well, I think I'm going to go and live in Sydney for a couple of years, and he was quite taken aback. And anyway, I said, look, we'll manage. We'll see each other every now and again. Yeah. And as luck would have it, that course in early 1979 it was, started here in Brisbane.
Oh, right.
And so sadly, I didn't get to live in Sydney for 2 years. But I did spend the next 18 months doing the course. And I was very lucky I didn't have any children, so I could take on as much of a workload as I wanted to, which I did, and completed it, as I said, in 18 months. But had the most wonderful time and met the most extraordinary number of people involved in teaching, predominantly women, not all of them though, some of them were men, and some of them are my friends today again, but they they taught me so much. And they came, a lot of the teachers in those days came from industry. So one person taught us a lot about how to present food.
Right.
Well, she'd worked on television in Mackay, so she had that background. Another had worked in Asian restaurants in Sydney, so she had very good knowledge of Asian ingredients, which in 1979
Was new.
we couldn't find lemongrass. We took the peel of a lemon.
Yes.
You know, it was just emerging. And I think, Rosemary, that's where I was particularly lucky. The food of that time was being discovered by everybody.
Yes.
And I was just one of those people. So a lot of the better-known chefs and cooks that we bandied their names around in the 90s and into the 2000s, they were just emerging, if at all, at that time. So it was a great discovery. Cookbooks were being written furiously. You know, the Woman's Weekly started its cookbook series then. They started their test kitchen that cost $5 million. And that was a great innovation. That meant that every recipe, they still say triple tested. Now that means cooked by 3 different people on 3 different appliances 3 times.
Right.
Who has the money to be able to put in a kitchen like that? And most magazines, the cookery editors, they're cooking at home.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you think about it, if you and I have the same recipe, we're going to have different appliances in our kitchen. We're going to have different methods that we do things. Do we actually cook those onions and saute them down for 20 to 30 minutes, or do we look at them after 5 minutes and say, right, I'm going to whack the garlic in and off I go? When properly sauteing takes a long, long time.
Right.
Any recipe that says saute in 5 minutes is
not right.
It's wrong.
But Vietnamese cooking, as you said, as really came into its own, didn't it, at that particular time? Now we've got Vietnamese restaurants everywhere, but we've also got what's called Asian fusion. How many restaurants open? They say they're Asian fusion. So what's your sort of taking on that? A bit of this and a bit of that coming from Asia? Or?
Well, you mentioned Vietnamese. Now, in the 70s, of course, we started to have the Vietnamese people coming into Australia, whether they were coming as boat people and the terrible journeys that they had to endure to get here, or, you know, later coming as students or for whatever reason. We were so lucky that we got the best of the flavours that they were bringing to us. We had no idea of Vietnamese food prior to those people coming here. And, of course, the thing that they found easiest to do was to open a little cafe. And now, of course, we're spoilt for choice. But I think Australia has benefited tremendously from our migrants. You go back a bit further to the Snowy River Scheme, and the workers from the Snowy River Scheme were a United Nations of people that had emigrated here specifically to work on that.
Yes.
So we had pretty much every country you can think of in Europe, in the central western or what am I trying to say? The western areas of Russia, we called it then, but the USSR and so on. We had people from South America, all over the place, and they all brought their food with them. And, you know, there's the old joke that Australians didn't know what spaghetti was in its real sense because we only knew what it was in a tin. But they taught us about the word pasta. And all its variations and so on. And now, of course, Italian food is the most loved cuisine of all. Well, why not? We have choices in it. And Italian cuisine doesn't mean just a pizza.
No.
You know, even though we've all fallen in love with pizza. But I think going back to Asia and its flavours, one thing that we have known about in Australia was spice. And that came with our English heritage. And the British had used spice a lot from their time in India. And what would a Christmas cake be without lots of beautiful spice?
Exactly.
But then we cottoned on to real Indian food beyond the tin of Keen's curry powder, you know.
Yeah.
And I know that when I learnt Indian cooking from an Indian woman living here in Brisbane, she opened my eyes to the most amazing flavours that I'd never imagined were possible. And I cook a lot of spice dishes at home because my husband and I just love that style of food. But to say it's true Indian or it's true Malaysian or whatever, because it might be what I've got rattling around in my fridge,
Yes.
what spices I've got, which are in good condition, all those sorts of things, and what I might feel like on the day. So that word of fusion is, I think it's quite adventurous with a lot of people, that there's a knowledge of the base ideas of those cuisines, and then you go off on your own and you just puddle around. And I mean, a lot of meals that I cook at home, I wouldn't say, oh, we had Indian last night or we had Thai last night.
It's a bit of this and
it might be a
that.
bit of a mishmash of things, although I think sometimes I see it being a little bit too adventurous if you take an ingredient like fish sauce. Fish sauce doesn't marry into absolutely everything.
No.
Morocco and fish sauce might be a bit of a stretch.
Now, you're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is Allison Alexander, Queensland's food doyen. Now, Allison, you tell us that you love to know where, obviously, the produce comes from. And I think you've said, give me a farmer and give me a paddock, and I'm as happy as can be. It's wonderful that you have that connection to the growers and the producers. And in actual fact, you, with Jan Powers, introduced the food market, didn't you? So can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how wonderful it must have been for the producers to be able to have that to showcase their produce?
I do have an innate curiosity as to where the food comes from, particularly fresh produce. I think there's always a story behind it, and there's a story to listen to, and that's what I love doing on radio. But I had this dream of having a farmer's market here in Brisbane, probably from about 86, 88, around that sort of time, and played with it in my mind. I'm a very slow learner, I think. But, you know, for the next 12 years or so, thought it would be lovely to have one here. We didn't have them. We had little craft markets here and there. And Peter Hackworth had the riverside markets, which were an entirely different thing. A lot of that was really beautiful artisan work. But anyway, so the idea sort of grew and grew. And by 98, I'd formed a partnership with Jan Parr to come together to do certain projects. We still did our own business aside from that, but as I said, there were certain projects we did together. And I had decided to go down to Sydney to have a look at the Pyrmont markets, which had opened just a few months before. And I'd said to Jan, look, this really is what I want to do. And she said, no, I'm not really interested in that. And I said, okay. I said, I'm just going to go to Sydney and have a look, which I did. And I think Jan had thought a bit more about it. And sure enough, on the day I was wandering around the market, there was Jan. And so we talked about it a lot more and thought, yeah, this is something, you know, we could do together. She had a lot of connections within the city with promoting it, and in the media at that time. I had all the farm connections, and the produce.
Yes.
So between the two of us, we actually complemented each other very nicely to set it up.
And it's still going now. Astrid, I think, is running it. Is that right?
That's exactly right,
yes.
And I withdrew after a while, and Jan carried it on and took on and did a great job, and she opened up further markets, and really it's one of the iconic visitor things you do in Brisbane, whether you're a local or you're someone that's coming into the city. And it's really good to see that, the local tourism organisation has listed it as, it's a must-do thing.
How wonderful.
And I
yes.
think that's great.
Yes.
And that says a lot about how people regard wanting to know where their produce comes from. And I will go to a market wherever there is one because I'll just enjoy having the conversation with the fellow with his cauliflowers and say, now, when did you plant them? And, what variety is it? And where's your farm? And things like that. That's what I love doing.
And they must love the interaction too with the consumer as well.
I think they certainly do. And it's more than that, though. There's a great education going on back to the farmer, because I can name numerous farmers who learnt a lot about talking directly to the end user. Yeah. If you're a farmer and you're selling your boxes of apples and they just go out on a big truck, you don't actually meet the person who eats your apple.
No.
So you don't know whether they really like that variety or not. There's a lot of conversation that can go on there. And I think that that's really important if you want to trial something that's new, like a new type of peas or carrots or something. What better than a farmer's market that you can say to the person on the other side of the table, here, try this. Tell me what you think of it.
Exactly.
What would you do with this when you get into the kitchen and get home? How would you cook it?
Yes.
And that direct one-on-one conversation has taught a lot of farmers who go to markets lots of things. One of those lessons has been, my goodness me, I'm not going to do very well at this. I think I'll give it up.
When that's all left at the end and you're packing up. And
but that's not a bad thing if you've learnt that out of it and you haven't gone into planting 200 acres of something.
Yeah. You've learned before.
Better to get the message early.
Exactly. Now, you became Queensland's first food fellow. How did that come about, and what actually is being a food fellow?
We've never quite worked that out. I think that was very kindly given to me by the Queensland government in 2011. And it was to do with, I think, the way that I promoted in just my own sense. I wasn't doing it in a paid capacity, but instinctively I was promoting what grew locally, what was in season, what did Queensland produce, as opposed to, look, our seafood is a really good example.
Yes.
We've just had Easter, and Easter's a big time for people to eat seafood. How many of them were really conscious in buying Queensland seafood? Our oceans teem with the most wonderful fish.
Yes.
There are restrictions on our fishermen, and I know that makes it tough for them sometimes, but we've got prawns pretty much all round our coastline, different varieties and available in different seasons. But just in recent weeks, I've been buying a beautiful fish. It's actually my favourite fish, called a diamond scale mullet.
Oh, right.
Now, the word mullet, I can just hear your listeners, Rosemary, say, ooh, I don't like mullet.
Yes.
Well, that's because maybe they haven't had it fresh enough.
Yes.
This is actually a different type of mullet altogether. It's got the shape of a mullet head, and it's related to mullet, but it's got this exquisite diamond shape, absolute on their scale. It's just, it's so beautiful to look at. But the flesh is pure white. It's not a brown-coloured flesh. It's a very different flesh. Right. And it's a very clean-eating fish. So, why not buy that than something out of Africa or Norway, Canada? And I'd say that for our salmon too, just by the way. Now, salmon, coming from Tasmania, a very successful industry there. We don't need to buy salmon from other countries.
Exactly.
We produce plenty here.
And the best, yes.
And the best, and the freshest, So, but we've got lovely small fish off the coast, things like whiting and bream, flathead, or our fantastic reef fish. So we're spoilt for choice. We really are.
Exactly. Now, in 2020, you were awarded the OAM, and that came as such a huge surprise. In fact, you thought that it probably was meant for somebody else. Is that right?
Yeah. It is. It's very true. Well, I just couldn't imagine that I was the recipient. There's another very well-known Alexander who's much better known than I am, Stephanie Alexander.
Yes.
And I thought, they've got the Alexanders mixed up. We both married Alexanders. And I thought, this can't be for me. So I actually rang the office in Canberra.
Right.
and said, I think you've sent this to the wrong person. But anyway, she said, no, it is meant for you, which really was an enormous thrill. I had no idea where it had come from, and then found after the announcement was made that 7 amazing friends,
Yes.
colleagues,
Yes.
people I've worked with over the years, and my husband were all in cahoots together.
All right.
They rang him for the fine detail on things. But yes, it really was lovely. And I found out exactly who they were because they all took me to lunch one day.
Oh, all right.
And then
But I would imagine
the secret was off. But
and very well deserved.
it really was a lovely surprise.
In 2011, you co-wrote a book called A Generous Helping, Treasured Recipes for the People of Queensland. Now, that was after the floods. So how did that sort of come about? You co-wrote it, and I believe it was very popular.
It was, Rosemary. It did come about where I had gone out, like so many others, as part of the Mud Army,
Yes.
and helped people clean out their houses and so on. And I watched all of these lovely cookbooks being, just ruined by the mud and the water and so on. And people didn't have a cookbook left. And I thought there must be something. I took the idea to the ABC and they picked it up, thankfully. And Madonna King, whom I was doing my program with at the time, she and I put the word out to listeners to send in a favourite recipe and we'd put them together in a book. And that's exactly what happened. The publishers gave it that lovely name of A Generous Helping, which
Yes.
I think was just exactly what it was. It was people saying, here's my favourite chocolate cake recipe or whatever, and enjoy it. And the book was a huge success. It raised lots of money that all went to the flood fund.
Yes.
And it was lovely just, I suppose, hearing the stories that came with the book. Every recipe pretty much has a story in it. The chicken and chorizo bake is still the most cooked recipe out of the whole book.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, so is it still available?
No. You'll have to go to Lifeline to their book fest and pick it up there.
Fair enough. Well, sadly, look, we're running out of time. That seems to catch up with us each week and then rushes by. But we'd love to have you back at some stage. But thank you, Allison Alexander, for spending time with us today. And I'm sure, look, our listeners have absolutely loved listening to you. And as I said, it would be terrific to have you back sometime because I've only gone through half the questions I was going to ask you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary.
Thank you. And
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.